The June topic of Pathwork Lecture 71, Reality and Illusion, was broken into two sections, so we covered it both during June and July. And I used a fourfold way, what to call it, structure, to hold the abstract ideas that were spoken about in Reality and Illusion. I've spoken of that in the previous video, but basically it's a way to look at coming forward and being fully present and looking at your attitudes. And it goes, show up, pay attention, tell the truth without judgment or blame, and stay open to the outcome rather than attached to it. So in June we covered show up, pay attention, which can be harder than it looks sometimes. And in July, we're looking at telling the truth and staying open to the outcome. I do these little videos after the meetings have happened, after I see what seems to be an issue that could use a little bit more elucidation. And what seems to need a little bit of support here is stay open to the outcome. And people frankly ask, what does that mean? And I think that staying open to the outcome goes to the very heart of duality. Because staying open to the outcome is only possible when you're not frightened of the different forms the outcome could take. So in other words, if you're in duality, which is a binary, dualistic, win, lose, me, you, them, us, good, bad, if you're in that duality, then if you don't get the option that you have desired, or that you are attached to, or that you see as the best possible outcome for you, then the duality is, if you don't get that, you'll lose. If we don't win, they win. So when you are open to the outcome, what can come up when you say that is a lot of fear. And what that reveals is we haven't yet addressed a much, much deeper level of duality in our lives. So the analogy I've come up with is that in business, since give or take 30 years, 30, 40 years, business has attempted to actually come forward and be more realistic to some degree, but also more inclusive of everyone. Instead of business being the equivalent of war, we win, they lose. Business managers have come along to the philosophy of trying to achieve a win-win solution. And that sounds great, and it's a great starting point, wonderful first step. And if you engage in business and you look for win-win solutions, you can think, well, there I am, I'm not attached. We found a common meeting ground, we've solved everything, and this, there isn't a duality here. But that level of working is, I struggled to find a better word. It's not superficial, but it doesn't address the underlying currents that may still exist. So in other words, even in win-win, there's the potential for lose-lose. Even in win-win, there's win-lose-lose-win. So we still haven't gotten rid of the idea that one solution is perfect and wonderful and acceptable and will give us an advantage, and another solution will not. We're just saying, why don't we make it even for both sides and so everybody's happy? But again, that doesn't address our fear that if we didn't get an outcome that worked for us, we would lose. We would be annihilated. We would be defeated. We would be destroyed. So underneath the veneer of civilization, if I can put it like that, underneath the veneer of being grown-ups and trying to do the right thing, there can still exist a terror of being destroyed. The duality can still exist. So it's not that you don't want to participate in a more enlightened form of business. you want to participate in a more enlightened form of government. It just means that there's more work to do. And the work underneath that winds up being very individualistic. In other words, we don't all agree what annihilation is. We don't all agree on what defeat is. So that's just one example of where we can think that we've got a starting point, and if we rest there, we don't address the deeper issue. Another example that I bring up from history, the Pathwork Guide often discusses elements of the Bible and religious literature and religions. And what he says is it's not that they are not true, it's that their truth is limited. In other words, the understanding at the time those materials were written, the understanding was limited. And so the explanations were limited. And his invitation is for us to take a deeper, fuller understanding that we have today and apply it to the spirit of that literature. Now I'm going to give an example from, it's slightly biblical, but it's also cultural. And that is that at some point, I'm not that good at Bibles, I can't remember where, but it says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. From our perspective today, that sounds cruel and barbaric. What we're not doing is we're not putting ourselves back in time. We're not putting ourselves back in the place where if you knocked out my eye, if you blinded me in one eye, I might decide to get my family or my village or my nation to destroy your entire village. I might kill your entire family. So there is a place in history where an eye for an eye was an extraordinary insight into fairness, an extraordinary attempt to limit human nature to only being an eye for an eye. Now, as we advance, we don't have to stay attached to that particular phrase. We don't have to stay attached to that idea. We can advance. So that we can say nowadays, for instance, that if you hurt someone, you need to be punished to some extent. You need to pay compensation to some extent. There needs to be an effect upon you for having caused harm. But to go back to that period of time and use that particular example because it was written down doesn't really honor the spirit of that moment, of that aha moment of saying enough is enough. Balance the scales and let it go. So I'm giving that as an example because coming back to today, when we do a win-win business and we say, there you go, it's even, the scales are even. Spiritual work is not about even scales. Spiritual work is about looking more deeply into our own hearts and saying, and what was I afraid of? Where was I tense? Where was I defended? Where was I actually unwilling to open to different circumstances because I only wanted a win-win, and whether or not it was deserved and whether or not it was appropriate? Because sometimes a defeat is appropriate. Sometimes we owe the taxes and the court says you have to pay the taxes, and the taxes we have to pay. Losing an adjudication is not necessarily a defeat. Sometimes it is simply a fact that we asked for a certain situation to be honored and it was not. And what Pathwork encourages is for us to go deeper and say, where was I actually trying to gain an advantage and give as little as possible? Where was I unwilling to be open to the outcome? Now, in business, as in war, as in politics, the reality is that we're not expected to give away our advantage. We're not expected to give our opponents a leg up. And that's why in those arenas, spiritual work is somewhat limited. Because we're talking about temporal outcomes there, earth plane outcomes. And again, Pathwork is about coming back to your own heart, your own self, and saying, was I loving in that moment? And if I wasn't loving, why wasn't I loving? And looking at the possibility of standing less defended, less tense, less judgmental, less prejudiced in any given situation, and being more aware of what might be a better outcome for a longer term period. And this is where duality butts up against the little ego. And the little ego says, I don't want to lose. I don't want to pay a fine. I don't want to get less than I imagine I should. And here we'd go to the analogy of some native Aboriginal tribes, thinking in terms of decisions that are good to the 7th generation. Not what do I want, not even what do I want for my children, but what do I want 7 generations from now for not only myself but everyone. It's a broader concept of win-win. So I'm introducing that now because that secret fear that we will be defeated is what underlies our unwillingness to open to a multiple number of outcomes beyond what we might have imagined, or even beyond what might be specifically advantageous to us in a given circumstance. Thanks for listening.